Thank you. My name is Paul Champ. I'm a director of the BC Civil Liberties Association, and I'm very happy this morning to be with Catherine Latimer, the ED of John Howard Society, and Michael Bryant from the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. And most of all, Lawrence De Silva, a former inmate in the federal penitentiaries who's had the bravery and the courage to come and tell us a little bit about what he experienced. It is deeply disappointing and frankly shocking that the federal government has chosen to appeal the BC Supreme Court judgment to end prolonged solitary confinement in the federal penitentiary system. You must remember that this Liberal government came into power on the promise that it would end indefinite solitary confinement. This Liberal government came into power promising that they were going to implement the recommendations of the Ashley Smith inquest. 3 years later, they haven't done that. Instead, this appeal shows that they intend to fight to save a system that breaks the law and makes our society less safe. And while the federal government insists on continuing this fight in court, prisoners continue to spend days, weeks, and months in small cells without meaningful human contact. They continue to suffer from severe physical and psychological harm because of that isolation. And some of them will be driven to take their lives. The government's decision to appeal is another example of justice deferred for prisoners. And these are some of the most vulnerable and marginalized members of our Canadian society. Courts in both Ontario and British Columbia have concluded that Canada's current solitary confinement regime contravenes Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It violates the right to life and security of the person, and it exposes inmates to increased risk of self-injury and suicide, in addition to causing permanent psychological harm. These are findings of fact of 2 courts of this country. The British Columbia Court also ruled that the laws are unconstitutional because they discriminate against people with disabilities and the mentally ill, as well as Aboriginal inmates, all of whom are disproportionately affected by the solitary confinement regime. And I'd like to clear up something today. In filing its appeal in the BC Court of Appeal, the federal government says that they need juridical clarity between the 2 decisions from Ontario and BC. With respect, that explanation holds no water. There is no lack of clarity and no conflict between those 2 judgments. Both courts struck down the current regime in the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, and nothing is preventing this court from this government from complying with both. Instead of doing that, again, the government is choosing to fight. Today, our message is clear. The government must stop the torture that results from indefinite solitary confinement. Lives are being lost. The courts have defined a way forward, and the government should stop fighting and obey these court orders, respect the findings of the jury in the Ashley Smith inquest, adopt the numerous reports from correctional experts and forensic psychiatrists, and accept the international law consensus that solitary confinement constitutes torture. Thank you, and we'll now have questions from anyone from the crowd. Thanks.